When I first moved in with Ryan, I thought I had hit the jackpot. The rent was cheap, the apartment was decent, and we got along well enough. 6 months flew by without any major issues, until the day Ryan disappeared. I came home from work one evening to find the apartment eerily quiet. Ryan's things were still scattered around, but there was no sign of him. His phone, keys, and wallet were left on the coffee table. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he had gone out for a walk or a late-night run. But as the hours passed and he didn't return, worry started to creep in. The police were called the next day. They searched the apartment, asked me a few questions, and filed a missing person report. They didn't find any signs of foul play. But that didn't ease my mind. Days turned into weeks, and still no word from Ryan. I tried to move on, but strange things started happening around the apartment. Small, unsettling things at first. Items would be moved from where I had left them. Food went missing from the fridge, and I kept hearing faint noises late at night. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe stress from Ryan's disappearance. But deep down, I knew something was off. One night, I woke up to a soft thudding noise coming from the basement. I hesitated, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I should investigate or just try to go back to sleep. Was it just the old pipes clanking or something more? The noise persisted, and curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was cold and damp, just like you'd expect. Boxes of old junk lined the walls, and there was a faint smell of mildew in the air. I scanned the room with my flashlight, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. That's when I noticed something strange. A section of the wall didn't quite match the rest. It was subtle, but enough to catch my attention. The paint was slightly different, and the wall itself seemed to protrude ever so slightly. I moved closer, running my hand along the surface, and my heart skipped a beat when I realized what it was. A false wall. Why would there be a false wall in the basement? What was behind it? I took a step back, fear clawing at my throat. I almost turned around, thinking it was better not to know. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't let me walk away. I found a crowbar in one of the boxes and pried at the edges of the wall until it gave way, revealing a dark, narrow space behind it. The smell hit me first, an overpowering stench of decay that made my stomach churn. I gagged, covering my nose and mouth with my shirt, but I couldn't turn away. I shined the flashlight into the darkness and froze. There in the cramped space was Ryan's body. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead, his skin pale and shriveled. He was bound and gagged, his limbs twisted in unnatural angles, and the sight was something out of my worst nightmare. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How long had he been there? Who had done this? And the most terrifying question of all, why hadn't I noticed? As I stood there, numb with shock, I heard footsteps overhead. Someone was in the apartment, walking around like they owned the place. My blood ran cold. Whoever had done this to Ryan was still here, living in the same space as me, hiding in plain sight. I turned off the flashlight and slipped into the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, moving towards the basement stairs. I held my breath, trying to stay as still as possible. The basement door creaked open, and the faint light from the hallway spilled down the stairs. Whoever it was, they stood at the top of the stairs, just out of sight. I could hear their breathing, slow and steady, like they were waiting for something. My mind screamed at me to run, to do something, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, before the door slowly creaked shut. The footsteps receded, fading into the distance until the apartment was silent once more. I waited, hardly daring to move, until I was sure they were gone. Finally, I forced myself to move, climbing the stairs as quietly as possible. I didn't stop until I was out of the apartment, the cold night air hitting my face like a splash of water. I called the police, and they arrived within minutes. They searched the apartment, but whoever had been there was long gone, leaving only the nightmare I had uncovered behind. It was only later, as I sat in the back of the police car, that the full horror of what had happened hit me. Ryan hadn't just disappeared. He had been murdered, right under my nose, and the person who had done it had been living with us, watching us, the entire time. When I started college, I was excited about the new chapter of my life, but the thought of finding a roommate was nerve-wracking. The dorms were full, so I had to find someone off campus. After scrolling through countless ads, I came across one that seemed promising. The guy's name was Anthony. He was a bit older, in his mid-20s, and seemed normal enough during our first meeting. He had a calm demeanor, and his story was that he was between jobs and needed a place to stay for a while. Desperate to find someone, I agreed. At first, everything seemed fine. Anthony was quiet, kept to himself, and didn't have any strange habits, at least not at first. But after the first week, I started noticing things that didn't sit right with me. Why didn't Anthony ever leave the apartment? I mean, he didn't have a job, but he never went out, not even for groceries or a walk. It was strange, and it made me uncomfortable, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just a homebody. Things got weirder at night. I'm a light sleeper, and sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was watching me. I'd open my eyes to find Anthony standing in the hallway, just staring at me through the open door. When I asked him about it, he'd just smile and say he was checking on something, but he never explained what. Was he watching me sleep? The thought made my skin crawl, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to overreact, and I had nowhere else to go. I started locking my door at night, just in case. One night, I woke up to a sound. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. Maybe a creak, maybe just the wind outside. I glanced at my clock. It was 2:15 a.m. I turned over, trying to ignore it, but the sound came again, clearer this time. It was coming from my door. Was someone trying to open it? My heart raced, pounding in my chest. I sat up, listening intently. The doorknob was jiggling, slowly, like someone was testing to see if it was locked. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My mind screamed at me to stay quiet, to not make a sound. And then, the door opened. Anthony stood there in the doorway, his figure illuminated by the dim hallway light. He was holding something, a knife. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unable to move, unable to scream. Why was he holding a knife? What was he planning to do? I finally found my voice. "Anthony, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "What do you want?" I slowly edged toward the side of the bed, trying to figure out what to do next. My phone was on the nightstand, but it felt like a mile away. I had to think fast. I couldn't just sit there and wait to find out what his intentions were. "Anthony." I tried again, more firmly this time. "Put the knife down." He didn't move. My mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, each one worse than the last. I had to get out of there. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I lunged for the nightstand, grabbing my phone and throwing the lamp at him. The lamp hit him, and he stumbled back, giving me just enough time to bolt out of the bed and run past him. I didn't look back as I sprinted down the hallway and out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I ran until I found a group of students walking back from a party, gasping for breath. I told them what had happened. Someone called the police, and they arrived within minutes. When they entered the apartment, Anthony was gone. The knife was left on my bed, and his things were scattered all over the living room. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The police took my statement and started searching for him. A few days later, I got a call. Anthony wasn't just some guy looking for a place to stay. He was a wanted fugitive, accused of multiple crimes in different states. He had been using the apartment to lay low, and I had unknowingly invited a dangerous stranger into my life. I moved out of the apartment that same day, crashing on a friend's couch until I found a new place. The thought of what could have happened still haunts me. I was lucky to have escaped that night, but I'll never forget the look in Anthony's eyes, the look of someone who was capable of anything. I still remember the day I moved into that apartment. It was an older building, creaky floors, and dimly lit hallways, but the rent was cheap and the location was perfect. I was assigned a roommate named Charles. He was quiet, kept to himself mostly, and didn't seem to have many friends. That was fine by me. I wasn't looking for a social life, just a place to crash after work. A week into living there, I started noticing bruises on Charles. They were faint at first, just slight discolorations on his arms. I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was clumsy or into some weird sport, but the bruises became more frequent and more pronounced. I couldn't ignore it anymore. "Hey Charles," I asked one evening while we were both in the kitchen. "You all right? You've got a lot of bruises, man." He flinched, almost like he was expecting the question. "I'm fine," he replied quickly, not meeting my eyes. "Just had a few accidents, that's all." "Accidents? What kind of accidents leave you looking like you've been in a fight?" I wanted to press him, but something in his voice told me to back off. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of Charles pacing in the living room. I checked the time, 3:27 a.m. What could he possibly be doing at this hour? I got up and went to see what was going on. "Charles, what are you doing?" I asked, rubbing my eyes. He froze, eyes wide, like a deer caught in headlights. I'm just thinking," he stammered. "Thinking about what?" I pressed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced nervously at the front door, then back at me. "I'm in trouble, Samuel. Serious trouble." "What kind of trouble?" My stomach tightened. This didn't sound good. He hesitated before finally blurting out, "I'm hiding from a gang. I crossed them a few years ago, and now they're after me." "What?" My voice rose in disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me? Why would you bring this here?" "I didn't have a choice," he shot back. "I thought I could lay low here, that they wouldn't find me. But they're getting closer. I can feel it." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing. Should I call the police, pack my stuff, and leave? But before I could decide, we heard it. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. Charles' face went pale. "They're here. Are you sure?" I whispered, panic creeping into my voice. He nodded, grabbing a knife from the kitchen drawer. "Stay behind me," he ordered. The next few minutes were a blur. The door burst open, and 3 men stormed in, faces hidden by hoods. Charles lunged at them, trying to fight them off, but it was useless. They overpowered him easily. I froze, unable to move, unable to think. They didn't even notice me at first. They were focused on Charles. I watched, horrified, as they beat him, the sound of fists hitting flesh echoing in the small apartment. Charles didn't scream. He just grunted, taking the blows until he couldn't stand anymore. One of the men finally noticed me. "Who's this?" he growled, pointing at me. "Nobody," Charles gasped, blood trickling from his mouth. "He's nobody." They looked at me, sizing me up. I held my breath, praying they would believe him. After what felt like an eternity, they turned back to Charles. "This is what happens when you mess with us," one of them said coldly before pulling out a gun and shooting Charles in the head. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I just stood there, paralyzed with fear, as they left as quickly as they had come. The silence that followed was deafening. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at Charles' lifeless body. Eventually, I managed to call the police, but by then, it was too late. They were long gone. I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. I didn't care about the money or the belongings I lost. All I could think about was how close I came to dying because of someone else's past. That's something you never forget.